international tax matters was passed unanimously, kicking off possible first steps towards a UN tax convention and a UN tax body. This could be an important contribution in financing the SDGs. Each year, countries lose billions of dollars in tax due to global tax abuse and tax evasion. This affects all countries, but it hits developing countries the hardest. The resolution could mean a great shift of power in global tax governance, away from the OECD to the UN, and billions of dollars in increased revenue for governments. Today, we have an excellent panel who will discuss what this resolution means and try to answering the following questions. What are the next steps for Africa Group and the supporters of the resolution to mobilize support for a specific treaty proposal? What are the barriers for reform of the international tax system? How can we build an alliance for a UN tax convention? In the panel, we have Alex Cobham, economist and chief executive of the Tax Justice Network, Pooja Rangaprasad, Director for Policy and Advocacy on Financing for Development in Society for International Development, SID, and Coordinator for the Civil Society Finance for Development Group. Magnus Løvold, researcher in the Norwegian Academy of International Law and one of the authors of the report, A UN Tax Convention. Closing the seminar, we are very happy to have State Secretary Bjørg Sandkjær, who will give the closing remarks. During the seminar, please post your questions in the question box. You can also request the floor during the Q&A after the panel discussion. Then we will start the panel discussion. And I would like to invite Alex Cobham to have his first introduction for about 5 to 7 minutes. Please have the floor, Alex.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for the invitation to speak. This is a kind of great panel, and I'm mainly just keen to hear what the other panelists have to say, so I won't detain us too long. But my role is to give a bit of background on the road towards stronger international tax cooperation, where we are today, the different processes that are in place, different responsibilities for them, before Pooja and then Magnus will talk about the kind of the directions that are now potentially in play, where we could go from here. Okay, so to think about where we are now, it's useful to go back 100 years or so, just to understand how we got here. So in the 1920s, after the end of the First World War, you have a process where the imperial powers are considering how the world looks. They've had the first big shock to globalization. So after a sustained period of growing international trade and international investment, largely within empires rather than across them, but still, the First World War has really put a stop to that, and things have gone backwards in a sense. And so you get the formation, among other things, of the International Chamber of Commerce as international business people, and actually businessmen, genuinely only men at that stage, come together because they want to have a political voice to try to re-establish what they considered to have been the good times from before. And that's happening at the same time as the imperial powers are putting together the League of Nations. And so quite quickly, the tax treatment and the trade treatment of international business becomes a key issue for the League of Nations. And you have this period through into the early mid-1930s in which the League of Nations takes a set of decisions, particularly about the taxation of multinational companies, that continue to frame the way that we do international corporate tax rules today. Now, the League of Nations disappears quite quickly, but the International Chamber of Commerce and the lobbying views they've brought to bear don't. And so two things really are sustained from that period, including into the early phase of the United Nations after the Second World War. One of those is the primacy given to the protection of capital in particular, the protection of capital from the threat of expropriation by states. And in particular, that means newly independent states that were former colonies of the imperial powers. That's one part. And the second part is about treating multinational companies effectively in a very privileged way, both for their investments across borders and for their trade. And that's continued through in the early period of the United Nations, before the number of newly independent countries threatens, through the kind of the inbuilt level of democracy within the UN, threatens to see decisions being taken that would actually regulate multinationals rather than simply easing the path for their capital. So by 1960, the current and increasingly former imperial powers are setting up the OECD, and that's a new version of what had been the post-Second World War European reconstruction body. And the first thing, more or less, that they do is give the OECD the power to set international tax rules. And that pretty much sets the context that we're still in now. So the OECD, rather than the UN, takes over from the League of Nations in setting the international tax rules, in working with the International Chamber of Commerce and other business lobby groups that spring up over time. And that takes us to a position that we're in now, where the OECD sets the rules that are effectively the rules for the world, built on the power base of the current and former imperial powers that are and remain the core membership. So the OECD has this role that the G20 has strengthened in the last decade, of setting international tax rules, even though the OECD's membership is much narrower than the UN. And OECD-related bodies like the Financial Action Task Force have responsibility for a set of related financial regulations, including around beneficial ownership transparency. And the OECD doesn't, of course, just deal with multinationals, it also deals with things like the automatic exchange of information about financial accounts that are held offshore. And now, again, because of the G20 mandate, the country-by-country reporting, kind of a key transparency measure for multinationals, which under the OECD standard hasn't yet generated much transparency because the data is only given to certain tax authorities, particularly OECD members. So where are we at the point at which, Pooja will tell us what's now happening at the UN? Effectively, we're in this kind of post-imperial legacy phase, what elsewhere I've called the third imperial age of illicit financial flows, in which most of the rules in practice are set by former imperial powers, and yet most of the countries affected by them are former colonies. The estimates of the cost of cross-border tax abuse globally from the State of Tax Justice, the last annual loss figure is $483 billion, $500 billion a year. The biggest loss is actually sustained by OECD members themselves, but the most intense losses as a share of current tax revenues or current public health expenditure, for example, are suffered by those former colonies. And so it's lower income countries who are driving now the push to be included, to have their voices heard, to have their concerns reflected in the rules that are being set. And that's what's given rise to, well, what perhaps Pooja will now tell us about. So let me finish there. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this also historical overview. It's very interesting and agonizing for some way, I would also think. Please, Pooja, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you so much for the invitation. Looking forward to this discussion as well. Yeah, I think picking up from where Alex left it, I mean, I think where we are now is the culmination of a very long fight in the United Nations. So as Alex mentioned, I mean, you had the League of Nations that started to discuss this issue, and developing countries for decades have been reminding the rest of the UN membership that, well, maybe we should discuss it now. And so it's been a fight to simply establish a process again in the UN to negotiate on tax. And I think developing countries have always argued that this is the place where every single developing country is already here. And this is the only body that has the legitimacy for global negotiations on such global issues. And so it's been many, many years, really many decades of this fight in the UN. The last time developing countries came close to winning this battle was in 2015 at the third Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa. And this was one of the last outstanding issues that almost crashed the conference. So for those of us who were involved, became really that close. And of course, the conference was happening on the African continent. And so G77 ultimately had to withdraw the proposal in the interest of consensus. But their statement then was very clear, saying this is still an unresolved issue, and they're going to keep this fight on in the UN. And so the next phase since 2015, we've really been focused on the General Assembly as the place where they could really pick this battle up again. And of course, civil society has been much stronger since that 2015, where we came so close and we realized we can actually get there. This is not just a theoretical, never going to happen in our lifetimes. Everything we were told over the years, this is not worth your time and effort. We realized we can actually get there. And so I think our efforts were also much stronger since then. And so the last few years, we've been really looking at the General Assembly quite seriously about, what sort of breakthroughs are possible. And we've had G77 the last couple of years table resolutions as part of an annual negotiation they do on illicit financial flows. So there is an annual General Assembly resolution on illicit financial flows. And of course, it's many issues. It's not just tax. But one of the things within that they have pushed for is the need for this negotiation process on tax. But of course, it's been blocked by the other side. And so it's kind of been locked in this back and forth. The other side blocks it and G77 withdraws. So that's what we saw the last couple of years. What Africa Group did last year was, in addition to this G77 proposal, they tabled another resolution, and really genius, very well done, because this resolution was only focused on tax. So it was a very short, focused General Assembly resolution, forcing all member states to negotiate on this issue of UN tax convention, that it's time to do this. So it wasn't just lost in contentious battles on a range of issues within illicit financial flows, but everyone really had to come to the table and discuss this. And then the Africa Group negotiators did a great job in not just then kicking this off with this resolution, but really seeing it through till the end. And of course, there was all kinds of pressure for them to withdraw, to back away, as is always the case. It's extremely political, this issue. And I think that was the big difference, where Africa Group refused to back down and ultimately even threatened to put it to a vote, which was also something we were keen to see happen in the General Assembly. Really don't just back away, just threaten to put it to a vote, force countries to be on record, and really expose who are the ones who are really willing to follow through on their so-called commitment on addressing these issues in a global forum. So I think when they threatened to do that, what we saw was actually OECD countries all agreed. So we ended up getting, even to the surprise of, I think, some of us who were probably the most positive about what could happen, we actually got a consensus decision, and even the United States eventually joined. So this has been really a fantastic breakthrough. And in terms of what comes next, and then I will stop with that for further discussion. What comes next is, of course, we have in the process a Secretary General report that would have to be published. There's been a mandate from member states now for the Secretary General to publish a report, and that the process should also include inputs from stakeholders. So that's an opportunity for us in civil society to input. And then there will be, and this is the really important part, which is there would have to be another resolution tabled at the General Assembly this year to decide on the modalities of the negotiations. So what will this process actually look like? And of course, that will be, again, another battleground, and we can get into some of those discussions next of what some of the risks might be there, but that's a little bit of a recap of where we are. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pooja. And it's good to hear what's actually happened on the ground there. Some 12 years ago, I was working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we tried to push for a UN convention against illicit capital flight, which was, as you may well aware, was not possible to achieve. So this is a good turning point to ask Magnus what actually distinguishes a treaty from other agreements, and why is this possible?
Thanks very much, Aaron, and really thanks for the invitation to speak. And first of all, I'd really like to say how excited I was, not being in New York, but seeing this resolution passed in the UN General Assembly last year, and really also now appreciated both Alex's and Pooja's reflections on this, which I found really useful. It all reminds me of how new treaties have come into being on other issues in the past. A vague and very complicated reference to, and I would like to quote from the resolution, a reference to intergovernmental discussions on ways to strengthen the inclusiveness and effectiveness of international tax cooperation through the evaluation of additional options, including the possibility of developing an international tax cooperation framework or instrument. Now, this almost incomprehensible sentence, now buried in the UN official document system, works as a sort of a seed that may, in a couple of years, grow into a whole new treaty. And this is, of course, how many treaty-making processes have started on other issues in the past. The right sentence, including in the right document at the right time, can kick international discussions on an issue into a new and more productive direction. And we can really only see the true significance of these things in hindsight, of course. And there's of course no guarantees that the resolution will lead to the adoption of a treaty, but we can, I think, already now do what we can to make sure that the initiative is given the best possible growing conditions, so to speak. Now to your question, the resolution that was adopted does not actually say, as far as I've been able to ascertain, anything about a new treaty. The original draft of the resolution did include a sentence that was a draft decision to begin the elaboration of an international convention on international tax cooperation. The adopted resolution only decided to start discussions and include in these discussions the possibility of a new instrument. So to be clear, the original draft called for a new treaty. This may also be called a convention or a legally binding instrument. Legally, these terms are interchangeable. There's just many wrappings, but it's the same thing. But the adopted and in my mind somewhat watered down a resolution calls for discussions about a framework or an instrument, but leaves open whether such a framework or instrument should be legally binding or not. And this is my point. I very much hope and would indeed recommend, I think, that governments decide in the end to develop a framework or an instrument that is governed by international law, that is a treaty. And this for three key reasons, and I'll try to be a bit quick because I'm keen to get into the discussion here. First of all, treaties is the normal response to so-called transboundary issues. That is, issues where the laws, the policies, and actions of one state impact in significant ways other states' ability to achieve their goals. This is really the core business of treaties, and I think international tax and financial transparency really fits, and illicit financial flows fits this bill perfectly. It is an issue of common global concern. Whatever actions, policies, laws that one state adopt in this area will have an impact on other states' ability to achieve their goals. So clearly a transboundary issue in need of a global coordinated response. And second, I'm sorry for being a bit technical here, but multilateral treaties are normally developed according to the procedures outlined in the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, which is sort of the treaty of treaties. And in these procedures, states will have to express their explicit and formal consent to be bound by its provisions through ratification or accession. And because of this, treaties normally reflects a deeper level of commitment than non-binding political or voluntary agreements. So why does this matter? I think for most countries, ratification of a treaty requires consent by the legislative branch of the government, the parliament or the Congress. And while this is exactly why some countries may be skeptical or hesitant to the development of new treaties, I think United States in particular is a country that has had some challenges in getting new treaties through their Senate. the formal role that treaties give to parliaments has key several benefits. First of all, parliamentary involvement normally takes the process of negotiating and implementing the agreement, make it more democratic and open to public scrutiny. Particularly important, I think, in this issue area. Because treaties bind states and not merely governments, the decision to join and comply with the provisions of a treaty becomes more credible and less vulnerable to changes in the executive branches of governments. As such, treaties are often more predictable, more robust, more reliable than voluntary frameworks. In short, treaties, because of their permanence, may help discouraging short-termism and encourage a type of long-termism that we need to solve global problems such as this. And also, involvement of elected representatives can also have benefits during the implementation of the treaty once it has been included, especially as is the case with tax and financial transparency. New legislation will be required to incorporate the treaty into domestic law. So including this perspective from the get-go, I think would be wise. Finally, and I'll stop now, but multilateral treaty negotiations, especially if they're conducted in an open and inclusive arena like the UN, will generate its own momentum. Treaty negotiations, they take place through different stages. It's preceded normally by sort of an ID and examination phase, which is currently where we are on this issue, and followed after adoption by what may be called an incubation and implementation phase. And all of these stages in the treaty-making process offer opportunities for states and civil society and also other stakeholders to raise global awareness of the issue and the negotiations. And in past processes and processes that I'm familiar with, global civil society coalitions have seized these opportunities and used the negotiation process itself as a hook for advocacy and communication. Now, multilateral negotiations may take time and effort, and this is indeed one common criticism against multilateral treaties. It is not really a quick fix to anything, but it does, because it takes time, offer great opportunities for capacity building. In the ongoing negotiations of a new treaty on plastic pollution, for instance, policymakers from around the world now are becoming experts in the material composition of different types of plastics. And I think we may expect significant capacity building resulting from a treaty negotiations on international tax cooperation as well. So I'll leave it at there. Hope that's a bit helpful. Back to you, Aaron. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Magnus. As I have a background as political scientist, so I also always like to hear those aspects of both the power and how it actually works in a democratic system as well. Alex, turning to you for the first question here. Many were happy when the resolution passed and maybe a little surprised as well. What do you think are the most important gaps in the international financial architecture to close with the strengthening and the international tax cooperation and the possibility of a UN tax convention?
That's a great question and a very big question. So maybe I just pick a couple of the biggest pieces of it. I think, you could say the reason that this went through, and as has been said, to significant surprise that it went through unanimously, is kind of the reason that we're here. Not that everyone's on the same page, but that everyone recognizes at least one of the two key issues with the current arrangements for the current international architecture. So what you need from that architecture is two things, and currently it delivers neither. You need it to be effective. Okay, so you need it to coordinate more or less all countries together in a way that delivers, whether you're somebody who has assets and income streams in different countries, or you're a multinational company, or you're a state, or people in a state who depend on tax revenues. You need the mechanisms to effectively to regulate international capital in that context to be effective. Now, We simply don't have that at present. You know, the OECD is now into the 10th year of trying to fix the international tax rules. The ambition that was present at the start of this second round in 2019, when they thought they'd finish by the end of 2020, has completely gone. You know, they were talking about two pillars, one of which would apportion, in the G24 proposal in particular, would apportion all profits according to the location of multinationals' real economic activity, so pretty much making profit shifting impossible. And a second pillar that would put a meaningful minimum effective tax rate of 25%, that then became 21 and then became 15, and now it looks like you can game it so you can actually get under 10% and still be kind of okay. Meanwhile, pillar one, from being all the profits of all multinationals, has fallen to being a sliver only of the profits of perhaps 80 or 100 of some of the biggest multinationals. All the rest of their profits and all the profits of all of the multinationals are still outside this. So that it's clear that this isn't effective, even for the OECD itself, for the OECD's members. It just doesn't have the ability to coordinate globally. And then secondly, it's also clear the architecture is not inclusive. You know, the OECD's attempts to become more inclusive, because the G20 kind of demanded they did, creating this thing called the inclusive framework, in which they promised countries outside the OECD, if you sign up to everything that we negotiated without you from 2013 to 2015, then we'll let you have a seat at the table for this round. In practice, what that's done was to create some albeit tentative expectations of being involved that have been completely dashed. It's clear, even for OECD members, there are many OECD member countries are very annoyed at just how much the US and France and one or two others, Germany, have basically shaped the deal that's now on the table at the OECD. And who gets the great majority of the benefits? Well, look, it's those same countries. So I think even for OECD members, the process isn't inclusive, and for everyone else, it's positively exclusionary. So we're in this position where the architecture doesn't work almost really for anyone. And that's why we've got this coalition now that put this resolution through unanimously. There are countries that want an inclusive framework, a genuinely inclusive framework, and there are countries that want the rules to be effective. At the moment, they are allied in saying this isn't working at the OECD. We need to move this forward intergovernmentally. The question, I think, for us, and I'll be fascinated to know, you know, Pooja, being much more plugged in at the UN, kind of your perspective on that, whether some kind of coalition of that sort can be held together as we move towards some actual detail, the kind of treaties that Magnus has discussed.
Thank you very much, Alex, for clarifying that. The former director of the Norwegian Directorate for Development Assistance, he famously often said that tax is the answer. What is the question? And I guess the question then is how to make it effective and how to make it work. So turning to you, Pooja, what are the barriers for reform of the international tax system? And who are in the opposition? And how could we convince them to support a strong UN process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of like what the alliances could look like and the opposition is interesting, because so far the fight has just been about a process, and that's been very clearly OECD, non-OECD, because those are the kind of the power struggle, and so it's been like a very north-south, you know, opposition in this in these negotiations. I think when you get to substance, which is what finally we're looking towards, it looks very different. And as Alex said, I mean, OECD is not a monolith. So you've had, you know, big tax havens in OECD that doesn't share the same interests as the rest of the group. So I think once we start to get to the substance, that's when we'll see the opportunities for much more interesting alliances really across the North and the South. And we break away from what has been so far, I think, on this issue. And I think, and even within that, with the specific issues we get to, we'll see different, you know, we'll see different possibilities of what those alliances could look like, where leadership might emerge, which countries, you know, interests are represented where, and how we want to build around that. So So it's exciting to think ahead once we get past the modalities, because we really have to ensure we have a strong modalities. We get back to, I think, what Magnus was mentioning, really the reference to legally binding, making sure that there is that kind of a stronger language agreed. And so even that will be a fight, and possibly around the same OECD, non-OECD divide. But once we get to the substance, I think the alliances will look very different because of the reasons Alex mentioned. And I think it will be our job to keep reminding countries that it's in your interest to get to that point where we're actually discussing substance, precisely because we need these new alliances. The OECD one doesn't make sense for OECD countries themselves. And you, in fact, need the Africa group, and you need other developing countries where you might find that you have much more in common, actually. So I think that's a little bit how I see it, but happy to discuss this more. Thanks.
Thank you. And then I have a question that goes both to Alex and you, Pooja. And as you mentioned, the OECD is an important player, and also historically, as Alex said in his introduction, in international tax matters. And some critics are worried that the UN-led process might be duplicated in the OECD. So how do the OECD and the UN process relate to each other, and should they coexist or maybe be merged in some way? I don't know. Pooja, do you want to go first? You're both smiling here, but
Sure. I think Africa Group would say they hope it's not duplicated. I don't think that's they don't want to see the same decision. So yeah, I think coexist. I mean, it's not unusual in UN negotiation processes for limited membership bodies to have their own input into the process. So, and that represents the interests of that limited membership body, whether it's OECD, whether it's regional, whether it's, say, European Union, Africa Tax Administrators Forum, regional commissions play an important role on issues of finance. And so they're all welcome to provide that input. And of course, member states can bring their own proposals. As long as all member states agree, it's not a reality. So OECD doesn't have to shut down. They can do their work. ATAF can continue their work for their membership board. Everyone can do their work. A global decision, you've got to come here, and that's where the negotiation happens. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. I mean, we know the OECD is feeling rather bruised at the moment. When they got wind of this resolution, they almost unprecedentedly, sent people to New York and lobbied pretty much unprecedentedly, saying that this institution, the UN, is simply unfit to do this role, and that all the OECD members and others need to reject the motion and back the OECD instead. So they created a sort of dynamic of it's them or us, which I guess the calculation was that their members would say, oh, well, then it must be you, and vote against the resolution. And in fact, what happened, as we've discussed, there was unanimous support for the resolution. And I guess that feels, that probably felt like quite a slap down to the OECD after how hard they'd worked. And I think they'd probably perhaps made some errors in their diplomacy, not quite appreciating the strength of feeling for the UN as the global body. But that creates a position now for the OECD where, we've had some signals that they're kind of thinking it through a little bit more now. And I think that, they can choose, really. They can either say, no, we are global, and, and this would duplicate us, and kind of keep fighting it, trying to claim somehow that they can be legitimate against the United Nations. I think it's clear that wouldn't work, but they may try it. But the alternative is to say, look, we were set up by the current and former imperial powers coming out of the Second World War, in order to protect the interests of our members, to provide them with technical support when they were working with each other and working with other countries, including former colonies. And that's a useful role that we can still play. We won't disappear if we accept that we are a membership organisation that is not globally inclusive, there's still a role, and our members are still the most powerful and richest countries in the world. So I think there is a space for them, and maybe in the change of some of the leadership that's happened in the last few months, there's an opportunity perhaps to step back and say, do you know, maybe we didn't quite play that just as well as we could have done, and if we take a moment now, we could engage in this process in a more constructive way, and perhaps that would put us in a better position in terms of how our members see us, not to mention others.
Thank you, Alex. That's a very good point. Maybe someone in OECD is listening in or will follow this up later on. Magnus, you raised your hand, and I was going to turn to you afterwards anyway.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to comment on this, and you saw me smiling as well. And the reason for that is that in all treaty making processes that I'm familiar with, at the very outset of it, those may be skeptical to that. Their first line of defense is that it will duplicate or undermine something existing. Like these proposals, they don't come out of thin air. There's always something pre-existing, always some effort to try to address a problem. And then when there's a new proposal on the table, if some governments or others are skeptical to this, the first thing they say is that this risk undermining existing mechanism and existing effort. So this sounds also very, in a sense, familiar. And I think, my reflection on all of this is that, well, if this problem had been already addressed, I mean, if the OECD had been able to solve these problems that we're facing, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today. So, I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yes, as simple as that. So, Magnus, you are one of the authors of the report, a UN Tax Convention, exploring the merits and feasibility of a new international convention on tax and financial transparency. First, is a UN Tax Convention feasible? And what were your main findings in the report?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And as to your first question, I think absolutely. A UN Tax Convention is feasible. And it comes back to something that I think Pooja said in her introduction, that I think we're coming to a point where I think civil society and governments increasingly realize that this is actually possible. This is possible to achieve. And I think that is a critical sort of moment in any treaty making campaign, that the actors involved actually think that they can bring this to a conclusion. And as for the sort of main findings of our report, and thanks, that's a much simpler question than you asked Alex earlier. And so since I get to answer what we have found, and I think first of all, what we find is that the case for a new treaty, a new UN tax convention is very strong. It's clearly a transboundary issue that cannot be solved through national or voluntary efforts alone. We also found, and to maybe reflect a bit on what we just discussed, that the ongoing processes within the OECD is unlikely to produce the solutions that we need to adequately tackle the problems of tax avoidance, profit shifting, and other tax-related illicit financial flows, and that we already discussed to some extent. But while the case for a new treaty is strong, we also sort of see that the resolution passed in the UN General Assembly last autumn shows that there is still significant political legwork to be done to create what we call a critical mass of support needed to get negotiations started. And to achieve this, I think we really have to work to build maybe a clearer common narrative around a new treaty. Which aspects of the problem exactly is it expected to solve? Through which international rules, regulations, provisions, mechanisms will these solutions be sought, and how likely is it that the new treaty will yield significantly better results than current efforts within the OECD or elsewhere that these efforts could be expected to deliver? So these are some of the, I mean, we sort of conclude with some questions that we believe that it's important to discuss, civil society, governments, other stakeholders to discuss and come to terms with before the issue comes up again at the next session of the UN General Assembly next fall.
Thank you very much. And just to follow up on that, what to avoid in a treaty process? but could undermine the process and make constructive cooperation difficult?
Thanks. Also a good question. And that gives me an opportunity to speak and address something that has come up a few times during this discussion already. And this is, the fact that the resolution in the General Assembly was adopted by consensus. And I agree that's significant. But I also think that if we're going to move ahead with this, and if we're going to create something meaningful and moving this process forward, and I think that's also reflecting a bit what Pooja said in one of her comments, we have to be prepared for the possibility that not all states will agree to move forward in the same way, on the same issues, with the same speed at the same time. So if we do get consensus in the process ahead, that's good. If not, that's also fine. I mean, most treaty-making processes, they start with a group of states that are sufficiently committed to actually stick their necks out and move ahead and put clear proposals on the table. The fact that all states are not on board initially is not necessarily a big problem. Of course, politically, one will work to bring as many of these states on board, and there's always a balance to be struck between sort of strength of provisions and participation, like who you want to have on board. But of course, treaty making processes, as I indicated in my introduction, it's not like you develop a treaty and then you've solved the problem. It's a dynamic process. Even after adoption, it's a process of universalizing the treaty, getting more states to get on board, get it signed and ratified, and also to implement it. So that's, I think, one thing, it's critically reflect upon the expectations sometimes that decisions in this field, and indeed in the OECD, which may be one of the problems, should be taken by consensus. And I think the second thing that I'd like to highlight is, I think this is for us in civil society and elsewhere, that I think we should not wait for governments or even international organizations like the UN or others to take the lead in this process. I think leadership will have to come from civil society around the world, and if we do our job, international support from international organizations and governments will follow. But we cannot wait for them to do this. Civil society will have to take the reins, I believe.
Thank you very much for that, Magnus. That was actually my next question for Pooja. What is the role of civil society in this process and in the preparations for the negotiations? If we got the go from Magnus here to take the lead.
Yeah, no, we of course have a huge role to play going forward, and we wanted this process in the UN. So I think we're looking forward to the work ahead. But yeah, I think one is, of course, the official process in the UN. And, this resolution, does include the need for stakeholder inputs in the Secretary General report. And I think the next phase with the modalities, I think that will be part of the push for us, making sure it's transparent negotiations, and we have an opportunity to also input as civil society in the negotiations. But I think one is, of course, the UN track, but there's, I think, now really a huge opportunity really at the national level, and making sure that we really have the buy-in from the capitals, and that there is strong investment, not just at the New York level, but also from ministries of finance. And so I think this, and now suddenly every country matters. No, it's not just OECD, each country gets a vote. So now we're really in the business of, we really need to mobilize around the world strongly, and we need national civil society being particularly engaged in their own contexts. And so it also democratizes how we work and how we are engaged in this issue. It's not just OECD and G20 countries, it's now all countries. And so I think it's there's a lot of opportunity there in terms of, I think, what we can do as civil society in a way we've not done on this issue in the past. And so yeah, so there's a lot of work ahead of us for sure.
And are you ready to take on that work?
To be part of it for sure, with everyone else, yes.
That's good, because that's also leading me over to Alex, actually, how to engage those who have maybe not been that engaged so far. You were also talking about that some of the pillars were being weakened, and how could we bring on private sector, academic institution, trade unions, those who can affect and maybe help strengthen some of those pillars who have so far been weakened a bit?
That's a great question. I want to say we will mainly be relying on Pooja. So, you know, Pooja will have a busy year. No, and honestly, the civil society group on FFD is a crucial actor in coordinating us all around the world, along with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. But thinking of those other groups, I mean, you know, there's also governments to consider the inclusion of. You know, we see, for example, Colombia leading a process in Latin America and the Caribbean of bringing together governments in advance of the full UN process to discuss their positions, and that seems very helpful. I think looking across both East and South Asia, it's less clear perhaps where that leadership is. I think partly because Indonesia has just had the chair of the G20, India has it now, and you might have expected both of them to have a leading role, but the G20 is slightly stuck on this because they've backed the OECD up to this point. So I think there is a question of kind of where that discussion among governments will move across Asia in particular. Then, you know, the other groups you mentioned, the private sector, I don't think we need to have any concerns that they are going to mobilize. And, you know, there's already been, in the last couple of years, I think significantly more private sector lobbying within the UN system around these issues, as the awareness has grown that, you know, the process is going to start, or things at least will start moving here. The UN Tax Committee has been increasingly effective, particularly compared to the progress at the OECD, and that's caused private sector to become more engaged already. What we haven't seen, and I was talking to a group of investors yesterday, is major investors getting involved, and they often have, you know, very much shared interests with civil society around the type of transparency. You know, they recognize increasingly the evidence that when companies engineer very low effective tax rates, shareholders actually lose out. They don't get a higher return, but they do bear more risk. And so investors too want the kind of complete transparency that could be delivered here, and rules to limit aggressive tax behavior. Academia is relatively engaged, and through the networks you see people on this, but I think now that this is moving politically, that will bring more researchers into this space. And then the trade unions, you know, already have a strong position. Of the 7 global union federations, it's Public Services International who have the agreed lead on tax issues. And since 2020, when they partnered with us on the state of tax justice, they've been committed to this process of a UN tax convention and an intergovernmental body. So I think things are broadly well lined up on that side. What I guess we need the next 6 months is really for governments to engage. We've seen a lot of cases where ministers or ministries of finance and foreign affairs haven't necessarily been on the same page always on these issues. And so now that there's a real thing moving, I think that's driving people to have conversations and talk about the different national interests in this space, with, I hope, civil society sort of making sure there's some accountability and transparency around that. You can see the next 6 months being really key, and then back to the General Assembly with the Secretary General's report to debate, and we'll see really if we can come down on a strong resolution to move forward the negotiations to a formal process.
Thank you very much. Then I'll only have a last question before we want to open for the viewers to pose their questions. So far, we only have one, so I would like to urge you to put in some more questions. We've set aside about 15 minutes to questions from the audience, so we hope we get some more. I also like to give credit to Sondre Nave, who's been helping me preparing for this and who has made all the brilliant questions. And since he's the head of our work on finance for development, I also asked him particularly to put in a question that he was interested in, what could guide us also in our work in Forum for Development. And I think this final question is probably has the tone of that as well. because then we would like to ask you to what should be the next steps for those who advocate for a UN tax convention and how we could build a successful alliance. And that goes through to all of the panelists. So we are very keen to hear your answers on that one. Thank you. Can start with you, maybe, Magnus?
Sure, happy to jump in on that, and it comes back to, I think, that point on civil society being absolutely having been, and absolutely crucial in bringing this issue up on the international agenda, for having worked for many years, but also in the future will have an essential role to play in efforts to move from discussions on international tax cooperation to real negotiations and hopefully adoption of a treaty. And I think, there needs to be, and I sort of sense that is information, a strong and well-coordinated civil society campaign, similar to the campaigns organized around other treaty-making efforts. I'm thinking about the processes on landmines, for instance, tobacco, the Tobacco Convention, cluster munitions, arms trade, nuclear weapons, and plastic pollution, which I already mentioned, where there are these sort of very goal-oriented civil society campaign organized around a very clear treaty objective. I think what civil society is already doing, how to, in terms of helping to frame the issue by collecting and disseminating evidence that demonstrates the negative transboundary effects of existing laws, policies, and actions, and use this evidence to generate a broader sense of these laws and policies and practices are not good enough, and that new treaty is imperatively needed. I think, bringing all that evidence to bear on the international treaty making process, I think, is civil society has an important role to play. Also, to be honest with you, in terms of generating a clearer sense of exactly what a new treaty will do, what are the key provisions of the new treaty? Will they, if implemented, contribute to solving the problem? And are we able to argue convincingly that governments will or can be pressured to agree to be bound by these provisions? I do not think that the answers to these questions will come from governments. I think they will come from civil society, and civil society will have to answer this. And finally, of course, and also to pick up on something that is already happening, of course, and mentioned, civil society has an extremely important role in coordinating international advocacy efforts and linking, as Pooja was talking about, linking the national advocacy efforts with the international efforts, and through targeted interventions, meeting with governments in capitals and UN hubs to bring states on boards with specific proposals. And of course, and I think also finally in global communication. I mean, we're here now. I didn't see how many people had logged into this event, but we are invested in this issue, but I think that there's 99.9% people are probably not aware of the efforts currently underway to get a treaty negotiated. And I think significantly more public awareness and pressure will have to be generated to create political conditions for a successful treaty. And again, civil society has an absolutely crucial role to play that. And I think the hopefully upcoming negotiation process will provide a tool that civil society can use, that something is happening to generate awareness.
Thank you, Magnus, for that. Pooja, we have your opinion?
Yeah, I think he's very nicely summarized it. Not that much more to add, really, except that we have a lot of work. I think that's the theme at civil society. We have a lot of work. No, I think the big thing, the big focus in the coming weeks is to really continue to stay ambitious in terms of our messaging, making it very clear, framework, instrument. It's a convention, it's a legally binding instrument. I mean, all of the other instruments related to illicit financial flows, you have the Convention Against Corruption, Transnational Organized Crime, there's no way, what else can the tax one be? It has to be a convention. So I think just continuing to stay on message and staying together as civil society, and as has been said, making sure that we're working at different levels from the global UN process to the national level and being really clear with this message. I fully agree on much more public awareness. I think the media and especially those following tax, there's been so much on OECD. We really struggle to get them to see how big this is. And unfortunately, in Africa, group tax initiative doesn't seem to get the the tax journalists as interested. So there's a little bit of that bit of kind of challenge, I think, for us to get past as civil society. But I agree that that's going to be a big issue for us to tackle. I will say on the private sector question, I mean, it's very much in their interest as well that there is a predictable, coherent international tax system. That's what they want. And what we're seeing with this OECD process is it's not what they're going to get either, even for private sector interests. And so if we're staring at the same kind of bunch of unilateral actions, that's not what the private sector wants. So I do think there is definitely opportunity to also say that for the private sector, also this is in your interest. We want the buy-in of all countries and have, a coherent system for multinational corporations. So I think there is a lot of work really in this kind of building this narrative, staying on message, keeping things ambitious, reminding governments and holding them accountable on what this ambition looks like. And in terms of what a tax convention looks like in substance, of course, we have Tove from Eurodad, who has published a draft on that, and Global Alliance and Eurodad. So we've started that process as well. So the idea is to always try and be as much as like ahead of the curve and really setting the narrative and the ambition in this process, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Alex?
Let me not duplicate, I think Magnus and Pooja really covered it. That raising awareness point is, I think, is key. We need to make sure each government is expressing a public position, in the next few months about how they will approach this process and what they hope from it, for good or bad, as it were. But we need enough public attention that those questions get answered to give us a starting point. And then I think, that role of, thinking about Tove Riding's draft at Eurodad, the South Centre briefing paper that talks about a framework convention, we need to be speaking into existence the possibilities for governments to effectively start to shape their sense of what they could be pushing for. I think we've done a fair bit of that, but there's more to do. That doesn't mean we need civil society speaking with one voice. I think it's quite useful that we're throwing different ideas in and thinking about the balance of different elements within it. But it needs to be a constructive, creative conversation in which people start to see possibilities, and eventually the zone of possible agreement between countries is going to start emerging from those myriad possibilities. So this is a moment of kind of a really fruitful moment of possibilities, and we should be really excited about what can come here, not just sort of worried about what might happen if people try and stop, but really thinking about where we can go. And this could change the world, right? If we get this right, undoing those global inequalities in taxing rights, recreating the possibility of serious progressive direct taxation in countries at all levels of per capita income is the possibility that's embedded in this if we get it right. So we should get it right.
Wow, that was very inspiring words, Alex. It was tempting to almost close the seminar with those words and let us float on that perspective. We'll open the floor now for the audience, and we have so far one question from Julie Wood. To what degree is a successful UN tax convention dependent on support from the OECD countries? Anyone who feel obliged to answer that one? If you want to raise your hands, or I can just choose one. Okay, Alex.
Well, I'm interested to hear others' views, but I think it's a good question. So thank you to Julie for that. I think you can imagine an answer going either way, right? If, let's say, we get a year down the line and the OECD countries en masse, or at least the core OECD countries, say, actually, no, we're not willing to give up our excess power, even though we know what we've got at the OECD is ineffective. We'd rather be more powerful in an ineffective institution than share it in something that could be more effective. Where does it go? I think the momentum may be such that we push ahead anyway. And what you'll find is you know, the majority of the world's countries being able to negotiate something that is probably more ambitious and more effective. And over time, slowly, the OECD would end up converging to that. But it will be slow and it'll be clunky and it will hurt the private sector. The possibility of double taxation will genuinely exist for the first time in quite a long time. Or enough OECD countries come along and say, no, look, you know, we know why we're here. We know why we backed this resolution the first time, and we need to make it work. That doesn't mean we stop being concerned about, you know, some of the things we've been concerned about, but we hold on to the need that this be effective, and we at least recognize the legitimacy of people who want it to be inclusive as well. And so we, you know, we take a more productive view. I don't think you get unanimity. You know, there will always be a Liechtenstein who will stand up and say no to everything, but anyone who lines up with Liechtenstein should wonder what they're, you know, what they're really in it for, and perhaps that gives you the possibility of a broad coalition in favour of something reasonable.
Very good. Do Magnus or Pooja, do you want to add on something to that? Magnus?
Just quickly to say, I fully agree with that sort of starting point, that no state or group of states should be able to veto or block this process. I think in another process that I'm familiar with, the sort of slogan came up that a process should be open to all and blockable by none. So I think that really needs to be the starting point, and very much agree with what Alex is saying there. Also, I understand this is not a direct answer to the question, but you know, in any issue there is a particular dynamic. There are groups of countries that have, you know, more or less formal alliances, and I think a key sort of benefit of a treaty making process, as Pooja indicated earlier on, is that it can help break up some of those dynamics, right? I mean, so that the primary identity of a country in a specific subject area may shift from, for instance, being primarily an OECD country to being primarily a UN member, you know? So I think a process can put some of these things in flux, and that can open up all kinds of interesting possibilities. So it's not a direct answer to the question, which I agree is a good one, but at least it's the best I can come up with now.
Okay, thank you. Pooja, do you want to add something? Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe just reiterating my earlier point that when we get to substance, I don't think these blocks will be what it looks like now, because we've talked about how the OECD process itself has failed to meet the expectations of OECD countries in the first place. So they also want to get something out of this. So what does a successful UN tax convention look like, and from whose perspective, and what are the alliances that need to form for all of them to get what they want? I mean, it's not going to be a simple answer of this is what the alliance will look like. I think on different issues, we'll see different countries pushing, and so it's going to be that kind of a messy process of negotiations. And of course, our job is to do that process of mapping along the way, and you know, being almost not really the architects, but maybe the architects of also what those alliances could look like at every step of the way, and depending on what the issue is on the table. And you know, there are always trade-offs in these processes, and different countries would want different things out of it in terms of what is successful tax cuts. So it's I think it's not going to be just OECD countries that it depends on, and everybody would want something out of that, precisely because the alternative is just not working for really most OECD countries themselves. Thanks.
Thank you. And since we have not received any more questions from the audience, I could also ask you if you would like to ask some questions, since we have have this fantastic panel, and we should use the opportunity for the last minutes. Anything that we haven't covered that you would like to emphasize or ask, Alex?
I'd like to ask both Pooja and Magnus a question, if I can. If you were able to write the General Assembly resolution that will start the negotiations, what would it include? What do you think needs to be there to give it the best possible start in life? Because that feels like maybe that's the next thing where some shaping and thinking into existence might be useful.
So, Pooja, would you like to go first? You're nodding.
Well, I was just nodding that it's a great question. And it's indeed, I think, what we're going to be doing literally in the coming weeks is to start actually locking down on like specific language proposals of what we would want to see in the modalities resolution, and starting to socialize that with, you know, member states and governments. So there will be, I think, kind of also a long civil society process to brainstorm. So I don't want to say that I have all the answers to that question and what that should look like. But I think, as I said, I think coming back to the fact that we started, you know, the Africa group started with a UN tax convention language, and now we're at framework instrument. I think one of the main things is to really clarify that with the modalities, what the scope of this really looks like. I think there will be some risks to watch out for, I'm sure there'll be some OECD countries that will try to find ways to make the inclusive framework, like just give the UN stamp, you know, onto the inclusive framework, just find ways to. So there'll be things that we need to watch out for in terms of what the other side might still try to do to weaken this process, so that battle is still not over in terms of process. I think in modalities, of course, we want to make sure that it is a transparent negotiation process, that there is space for civil society to input. There are always ways in which those things can also, we can lose those battles as well. So I think there's going to be kind of a long laundry list of looking at specific language proposal and socializing that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Magnus?
Yeah, it's a great question that I'm not entirely sure how to answer. I agree with everything that Pooja said. I wonder if probably, you know, it needs to be a clear decision point in one of the operative paragraphs of the resolution. It needs to be, you know, that the General Assembly decides to start negotiations on an intergovernmental or to start an intergovernmental process of negotiations leading to the adoption of a legally binding instrument or international tax cooperation or something to that end. That decision needs to be really clear, I think, as a sort of a starting point. But fully agree with those points about participation, which I think is important to get in early on, civil society participation, transparency around the process, etc. But then I think I would probably warn against making the General Assembly resolution containing the mandate in negotiations sort of a pre-negotiation of what should go into the treaty. So rather keep it lean to the point and sort of leave all the substantive issues to the negotiations themselves. Otherwise, it can quickly become quite messy. But that said, how the entire process is framed, sort of the understanding of the issue will be reflected in the preambles of the resolution, and that will be really important, I think, in sort of framing the broader understanding and the context around this.
Very good, thank you. Pooja, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think maybe just one point to add. I think with this modalities resolution, where we want to clarify, I think the fact that this is a convention, legally binding instrument, wording around that, the next step will then be the budget process to make sure that this is actually well funded before we even get to the substance. And so that is also going to be a fight. So there is still a little bit of a process, just a process-related process, but still process-focused, I think, next steps before we get to the substance, because if it doesn't get the adequate budgetary support, then we're not going to have a very strong negotiation process, making sure the kind of technical bodies that will provide the inputs, all of those things that requires then funding. So I think those are the strategic questions, I think, Alex, that you will also be pulled into in the coming weeks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I guess that funding is a good stepping stone to turn to the Norwegian State Secretary, Berg Sandskjær, who famously last week also said that, how do you spell international finance? Please take the floor, Björg.
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, indeed. It was great to stand in front of this huge audience at the NORAD conference here in Oslo and ask them how to spell development finance. And the solution, of course, is TAX. And I have to say, I didn't come up with it myself, but you know, good ideas are worth repeating. But thanks for inviting me and for inviting all of us to this discussion. It's important that we have these discussions, and of course, civil society is relentless pursuing this agenda, keeps it high and you know, on top of all our minds. And I believe also has been instrumental in raising the level of ambition in multilateral fora on these questions. And of course, with the recent resolution on tax cooperation in the UN, as many of you have said already in the discussion, there is real momentum to advance the discussions. And I think that's, you know, we're at a very interesting point in time. We also know that financing needs for developing countries are massive, they're growing, and combined with increased inequality between countries and within countries, there's cause for collective alarm. And I believe that's what's at stake as we look ahead to the next global conference on financing for development in 2025. I mean, I heard panelists mention the previous conference in Addis. We are gearing up, all of us, towards now the next conference in 2025. And as Norway, we do commit to take on a substantive role in trying to, you know, drive that process and the preparation and making it as successful as possible. Because we do see the merit of making the financial system more robust in the area of taxation. Internally in the government, we are working more closely with the Ministry of Finance. It's important to have them on board as well. And we are working, I mean, you know that Norway's position on global tax matters follows several tracks at the same time. We are a principal donor to the UN's tax work, both to the tax committee and the UNDP's capacity building efforts at country level. And I heard several here talk about, of course, the discussions that are happening in the OECD. Well, we do try to support those as well. We are one of the top donors to the important work in the OECD and G20's inclusive framework, and we continue to support civil society's important work in this area. I believe one of the key roles that we can have as the Norwegian government is to try to bridge these different discussions and bring them all together, including bringing in allies across regions in the area of illicit flows as well as taxation. So we do believe that a key success factor depends on the ability of the UN, as well as the OECD, World Bank, and others to mutually reinforce each other's efforts and to build on what has been achieved. And of course, I mean, many of you have mentioned the UN as an excellently placed global norm setter with that universal legitimacy that we need to be successful in what we're trying to do here. But we also believe that the UN needs to be better coordinated with the technical expertise that resides in other standard setting bodies. Because only through increased multilateral coordination, we can truly create a more robust financial system. So I think you're quite familiar with Norway's role in this, and we will continue to try to bring together the different actors in this discussion, which is even more important. I mean, we know that tax in the end is about trusts. We know without financial accountability, transparency, and integrity, tax-paying citizens lose confidence in corrupt leaders and become disillusioned with public institutions. And that would be a very dangerous development. So just to end again by reiterating Norway's commitment to this agenda. Thank you again for pushing us and making, you know, raising the ambition, keeping this discussion very much alive. And again, to reiterate the that we will be very much involved in the preparations for the next global conference on financing for development, and also to say that your role as civil society in those preparations will be very, very important. So we look forward to continuing these discussions to achieve our common goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary Bjørg Sandskjær. Those are good words, and we have also recorded this seminar, so it will be made available at the SDG webpage in Bergen, and we can also send it to those who are interested, because there was a lot of good ideas so were put forward here, and we look forward to follow them up with many of you. So I'd just like to ask Sondre if you want to turn on your camera. We can give you. I can't. He cannot put on his camera. So once again, I want to give credit to Sondre, who many of you probably know, who will follow up this work for Forum in the future. So thank you very much. Excellent panel. It's been an honor to spend this almost 1.5 hours together with you. And I look forward to hopefully a good convention on tax. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to be part of the
Thanks, everyone.
discussion.
Bye-bye.
Bye.